Working as a food delivery driver in a big city can be exhausting and unfulfilling, but for me, it's a means to an end. My name is David. I'm 30 years old, and I never had the chance to study when I was younger. However, I've always dreamed of going to college and getting a degree. Working as a delivery driver is a way to save money for my studies. Every day, I strive to earn enough to pay for my future tuition and someday achieve my dream. The routine can be monotonous, but knowing that I'm working towards a bigger goal keeps me motivated. That particular night, the traffic was unusually light, and the streets were quieter than usual. Despite the calm, there was a strange feeling in the air that I couldn't ignore. However, I didn't pay much attention to it and continued with my deliveries, unaware of what lay ahead. It was 11 o'clock at night when I received an order from a nearby restaurant. The delivery address took me to a residential area I didn't recognize. As I approached the address, I noticed that the house was on a dark, poorly lit street, which heightened my sense of unease. I rang the doorbell and waited. After a few moments, a soft, almost inaudible voice responded from the other side of the door. "Leave it at the door and go," said the voice. Despite having prepaid for the order, the strange instructions and the tone of the voice unnerved me. I left the food at the door as instructed and quickly walked away. As I mounted my bike to leave, I glanced back and saw the door slowly opening. A dark figure peeked through the opening, but I couldn't see its face. I sped away as fast as I could, my heart pounding. After leaving the food at the door and quickly riding away, I couldn't help but think about how strange that order had been. The soft voice and dark figure that peeked through the door left me with a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on the next order, but the image kept replaying in my mind. As I rode through the dark and empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept glancing at my rearview mirrors, hoping not to see anything unusual, but the sensation of being followed wouldn't go away. I tried to shake off the feeling and concentrate on my work, but something in the air felt different that night. When I arrived at the next address, I delivered the food without any issues. The normalcy of that delivery helped calm me down a bit, but the unease persisted. While waiting for the next order, I found myself thinking about the dark figure and the soft voice I'd heard earlier. I decided to keep working, hoping the rest of the night would be less strange. The night wore on, and the orders kept coming in. I received a new order that took me back to the same neighborhood where I'd made the strange delivery earlier. When I arrived, I noticed that this time the address was right next to the house where I had left the food earlier. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the dark figure I had seen. I rang the doorbell and waited for someone to answer. An elderly woman opened the door and smiled at me kindly. I handed her the food, and as I did, I noticed that she was trembling slightly. I tried not to appear nervous and wished her a wonderful night. As I was walking away, the woman called out to me, "Young man, could you help me with something in the house next door? There's something strange, and I don't want to go alone." Surprised by her request, I decided to help her. I walked with her to the house next door, where I had made the previous delivery, and saw the dark figure. The woman explained that she had heard strange noises and seen lights flickering on and off in that house over the past few nights. My unease grew, but my curiosity pushed me to investigate further. When we reached the door, I heard a faint whisper and felt a chill run down my spine. I knocked softly on the door, and to my surprise, a little girl opened it. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and distrust. I asked if everything was okay and if her mother was home. In a barely audible voice, the girl replied, "My mom is upstairs." The elderly neighbor who had been observing from a distance encouraged me to proceed, promising to monitor the entrance. I decided to follow the girl, although something inside me told me I should leave. The house was cold and dark, and every step I took echoed in the empty hallway. As we climbed the stairs, I tried to talk more with the girl. "Are you alone here?" I asked. She shook her head. "My mom is upstairs. She's always upstairs," she repeated. Her tone was monotonous and distant, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. When we reached the second floor, the girl stopped and pointed to a closed door at the end of the hallway. I felt a knot in my stomach as I approached the door. The girl stood still, watching me silently. I knocked softly on the door, hoping for a response from the other side. But all I heard was a faint murmur that seemed to come from inside the room. With my heart pounding rapidly, I decided to slowly open the door. As I did, I discovered an empty, dark room with furniture covered in dust and curtains closed, barely allowing the streetlight in. In a corner of the room, I saw a hunched figure seemingly muttering to itself. I approached cautiously, and the figure lifted its head. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were empty, and she seemed not to see me at all. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked in a trembling voice. The woman didn't respond, continuing to murmur unintelligible words. Fear overtook me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I slowly backed away towards the door, not taking my eyes off the woman, and left the room, closing the door behind me. When I came out, I realized that the girl had disappeared, and I found myself alone in the house, my heart pounding. I quickly ran down the stairs, feeling like something was following me. When I reached the entrance, the elderly neighbor was waiting with a worried expression. "What happened?" she asked. "There's something very strange in that house," I replied, unable to hide my nervousness. As we left the house, the neighbor and I discussed what had happened. I told her about the woman, her strange behavior, and how the girl had vanished without a trace. The concern on her face grew, and she suggested we call the police. Although I hesitated at first, I knew it was the right thing to do. Something very strange was happening in that house. The neighbor took out her phone and called the police, explaining the situation and asking them to send someone as soon as possible. The sense of surveillance persisted throughout our wait. We stayed near the entrance, alert to any movement inside the house. Minutes passed slowly, and every little noise heightened our anxiety. Finally, we heard the sirens of the approaching police. 2 officers arrived, and we explained what we had seen and heard. The officers exchanged skeptical looks, but agreed to investigate the house. They asked us to wait outside while they went in, and we did, watching every move closely. While the officers investigated the house, the neighbor and I stood on the sidewalk, waiting with growing anxiety. Every minute that passed without news from the police increased our concern. We could hear their footsteps echoing inside the house, but everything else was eerily silent. After what seemed like hours, one of the officers emerged from the house with a grave expression. He informed us that they hadn't found anyone inside, nor any trace of the woman or the girl I had described. They found the house empty and completely disordered, as if no one had lived there for a long time. The neighbor and I exchanged incredulous looks at the news. The officer asked us to stay away from the house and call again if we noticed anything suspicious. As they left, the neighbor whispered to me that she still felt something was not right. Unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that night's events were far from over. We decided it was best to go home and try to rest, although we knew it wouldn't be easy. After the police left, the neighbor and I returned to our homes, still disturbed by what we had experienced. The next day, as I prepared for another night of deliveries, I heard that someone in the neighborhood had died. My curiosity and concern grew, so I decided to find out more. I discovered that the person who had passed away was the same neighbor who had accompanied me to the abandoned house. The news left me in shock. That someone who was with me the night before was dead shocked me. I became afraid and couldn't stop thinking about whether what we found in that house caused her death. I felt a mix of guilt and terror. I remembered every detail of that night. The girl, the woman, the whispers. Everything seemed to point to something supernatural. Anxiety and fear accompanied me throughout the day, and I wondered if I would be safe. That night, I couldn't sleep, thinking about the neighbor and what had happened. A few days later, the neighborhood learned that someone had set fire to the abandoned house. I learned that the neighbor's husband, in an act of desperation and revenge, had decided to set the house on fire to avenge his wife's death. The police arrested him, but the fire destroyed much of the house, leaving only ruins. Having witnessed all of this up close, I began to experience strange things. I constantly felt dizzy and nauseous, and I couldn't stop thinking about the events of that night. I was convinced that something from that house had affected me, something invisible but palpable in every fiber of my being. As the months passed, I decided to seek help. I consulted a local healer who recommended performing a ritual to cleanse any negative energy I might have brought with me. I carried out the ritual seriously, and gradually, my symptoms began to improve. However, since then, I've always remained alert during my deliveries. I learned to trust my instincts and be cautious, knowing that some things, no matter how inexplicable, can have a real impact on our lives. I really hope you like this scary tale. I would be interested in hearing your opinions or experiences if you have any similar ones. Please remember to hit the bell symbol, like the video, and subscribe to the channel if you find it entertaining, so you don't miss any more stories.
Working as a food delivery driver might seem simple, but the daily routine can become monotonous and exhausting. Most days, I find myself racing against the clock, trying to deliver each order on time while navigating the city's chaotic traffic. Impatient customers and long working hours can make this job quite stressful. Each day is a repetition of the previous one, receiving the order, picking up the food from the restaurant, and delivering it to the given address. Sometimes I wonder if something exciting or different could happen, but I quickly dismiss those thoughts. The reality is that my job, while necessary, is repetitive and rarely offers surprises. My name is John. I'm 28 years old, and I've been working as a delivery driver in Los Angeles for 3 years. Although I sometimes feel frustrated by the monotony of the job, I take comfort in knowing that I'm earning money to support my family. I never would have imagined that one ordinary night, a simple delivery would change my perspective on what I considered a boring job. It was a quiet night, with nothing out of the ordinary when I received an order from a downtown restaurant. The delivery address took me to an old house in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. As I approached, I noticed that the house was in a state of neglect, with an overgrown garden and no lights on. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried not to give it much importance. When I arrived, I realized there was no doorbell, so I knocked softly on the door. There was no response. After a few moments, an old woman appeared at the door. Her presence was unsettling. She had a piercing, deep gaze, as if she could see through me. She thanked me for the delivery and took the food without saying another word. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house seemed too dark and silent. I decided to brush off the feeling and continue with my work, but a part of me couldn't stop thinking about that old woman and the strange sensation she had left me with. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a series of events that would change my perception of reality. That same night, as I continued making deliveries on my bike, I couldn't stop thinking about the old woman and her house. There was something about her gaze that deeply disturbed me. I decided to ignore my feelings and focus on my work, but the image of that house and the old woman lingered in my mind. While waiting at a traffic light on one of the following deliveries, I looked around and could have sworn I saw the silhouette of the old woman in the distance, watching me. I shook my head, thinking it was just my worn-out mind playing tricks on me. However, the sensation of surveillance persisted. After delivering several more orders, I finally finished my shift. However, as I rode home on my bike, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The image of the old woman kept haunting my thoughts, and no matter how much I tried to relax, something inside me knew that this wasn't the end of my encounter with her. The following night, while making deliveries on my bike, I received another order that took me back to the same neighborhood. To my surprise, it was the same address as the night before. A chill ran down my spine as I recalled my encounter with the old woman, but I tried to stay calm and continue with my work. When I arrived at the house, the door was already slightly open, and the old woman was waiting in the doorway. Her gaze was even more penetrating and unsettling than the first time. She thanked me again, but this time I noticed something different in her tone. She seemed almost anxious to receive the food. I handed over the order and walked away as quickly as possible. As I walked back to my bike, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly but saw no one. Even though the garden was neglected, the atmosphere made my hair stand on end. With my heart pounding, I got on my bike and started it, eager to get away from that house as quickly as possible. The next night, while doing another round of deliveries, I felt relieved not to receive another order for the same address. However, as I passed near the old woman's house, I couldn't help but take a look. To my surprise, the house was completely dark, and it seemed even more abandoned than before. There were no signs of life or the old woman. I decided to stop briefly to observe from a distance. I saw no movement and heard no sound. The feeling of unease returned strongly, and part of me wanted to get closer to investigate further, but common sense told me not to. I got back on my bike and continued with my deliveries, trying to forget about the house and the old woman. Later that night, when I finished my shift, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I decided to ask some fellow delivery drivers if they had experienced anything similar at that address. Surprisingly, several of them mentioned delivering to the same house, but they described different people living there. The inconsistency in their stories left me even more confused. Intrigued by the discrepancies in my colleagues' stories, I decided to investigate more about the house and its history. I spoke to a neighbor who lived near the abandoned house. He told me that the house belonged to a family that had lived there for many years, but all of the members had died under mysterious circumstances decades ago. The neighbor mentioned that after the family's death, several people had tried to live in the house, but they all left quickly due to inexplicable and terrifying experiences. Almost no one dared to approach the house, especially at night, due to its reputation for haunting. With this new information, I felt even more unsettled. The house's history and my colleagues' experiences made me doubt my own encounters. I decided to stay away from that area in my future deliveries, but the curiosity and sense of mystery didn't leave me. Something told me I hadn't seen the last of that old woman in her house. One night, while making deliveries on my bike, I received an order that took me back to the same neighborhood. Despite my efforts to avoid it, I had to pass near the old woman's house. As I approached, the feeling of unease grew. I tried to concentrate on the delivery, but the darkness and silence of the neighborhood made me stop in front of the house. I decided to get closer once more, feeling a chill run down my spine. The house was completely dark, but this time I saw a figure in the second-floor window. The figure seemed to be watching me, motionless. Against my better judgment, I walked to the door and knocked softly. There was no response, but the figure disappeared from the window, leaving only a shadow. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang behind me. I turned quickly and saw that the garden gate had slammed shut. Fear overtook me, but something pushed me to continue. I sensed a cold presence and a barely audible whisper saying, "You are not alone." Panic set in, and I backed away quickly, tripping over the entrance. I got on my bike and sped away, leaving the house and that unsettling voice behind. The following nights, while making deliveries, I couldn't stop thinking about the old woman's house. Although I tried to avoid passing near it, Occasionally, my routes would take me to the same area. Every time I saw a dark house, I couldn't help but look at the windows, hoping not to see anything but always fearing to find something. One night, as I passed near another dimly lit house, I saw a familiar figure in one of the windows. The same old woman was watching me from inside, motionless, with the same penetrating gaze. I felt a chill run through my body and sped up my bike, trying to leave the terrifying sight behind. The repetition of these encounters left me disturbed and exhausted. I began to question my sanity and doubt what I was seeing. I knew something strange was happening, but I had no answers. Every delivery became a test of courage, and the image of the old woman kept haunting me, appearing in the most unexpected places and keeping me in a constant state of fear and tension. After several disturbing encounters with the old woman's figure, I decided I needed answers. One night, after finishing my deliveries, I went to the neighborhood where the house was located and spoke to a neighbor who lived nearby. I asked if he knew anything about the old woman and the house's history. The neighbor, an older man, looked at me seriously and said that the house had been vacant for years. He told me that the last resident had been an old woman who lived alone and died under mysterious circumstances. Since then, no one has dared to approach the house, especially at night, due to its reputation for haunting. He explained that several neighbors had seen apparitions and heard strange noises coming from the house. He even mentioned that some food delivery drivers, like me, had reported similar encounters with the figure of an old woman in the windows. The neighbor's story confirmed my fears and made me realize that I wasn't alone in my experiences. Despite trying to avoid the house, the disturbing events continued. The spectral figures and unsettling whispers didn't leave me alone. They followed me every night. My wife, worried about my well-being, suggested we move to another city to escape the apparitions that tormented me. We decided to move to San Francisco, hoping that the change of environment would give us the peace we desperately needed. However, the feeling of constant surveillance and persistent whispers persisted even in our new home. The ghostly figures kept appearing in windows and dark corners, filling me with constant fear. The situation became unsustainable. My mental health deteriorated rapidly, and my relationship with my wife also suffered. Finally, I decided to quit my job as a food delivery driver. I found a daytime job, hoping that the sunlight would keep the apparitions at bay. Despite the decrease in encounters, the sense of pursuit persisted. The experience left me marked forever, reminding me that some mysteries are impossible to escape, no matter how much we try to run away.
Working as a food delivery driver in a big city can take you to fascinating and sometimes unsettling places. My name is Andrew. I'm 32 years old, and I've been working for a popular delivery app for 5 years. Although the job can be repetitive at times, I enjoy the variety of people and places I encounter daily. Unlike other jobs I've had, being a delivery driver allows me to constantly move and explore different parts of the city. But not everything is rosy. I've had some experiences I'd rather forget, like that night when they sent me to an isolated area where I'd never been before. That day started like any other, with a series of regular orders in familiar areas. But as night fell, I received a request to go to a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. There weren't many houses around, and the atmosphere felt heavy and gloomy. Even though I was accustomed to the job's uncertainty, this direction immediately made me wary. The notification for the new order came just as I was about to finish my shift. It was an address in an area I didn't recognize. I felt a slight unease but decided to accept the order. There was always something intriguing about exploring new places, and although my intuition told me this place was different, I got on my bike and headed there. As I left the city's hustle and bustle, the streets became narrower and darker. The streetlights were scarce, and the silence was overwhelming. I followed my GPS directions, but the farther I went, the more isolated I felt. Finally, I arrived at a dirt road surrounded by tall trees that barely let the moonlight through. After a trip that seemed to last forever, I reached the house. It was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a dense forest. The structure was old and appeared abandoned, but there was a dim light in one of the windows. I parked my bike and walked to the door, my heart pounding, wondering who could live in such a remote place and why they had ordered food at this hour. After parking my bike, I approached the house door. As I got closer, I noticed that the old and worn structure had a sinister air. Every step I took echoed in the silence of the night, and the dim light in the window seemed to flicker as if struggling to stay on. I knocked on the door cautiously, hoping someone would answer. A few seconds passed, which felt like minutes, until I finally heard the sound of slow footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened slowly, revealing an older woman with a neutral expression and deep eyes that seemed to see beyond the obvious. The woman looked at me intently before speaking. "Good evening, young man. Thank you for bringing the food," she said in a soft but firm voice. There was something in her tone that made me feel uneasy, but I tried to maintain my composure. I handed over the order, and I noticed her hand trembling slightly as she took the bag. "Do you need anything else?" I asked, trying to sound friendly, but my instinct told me to leave quickly. The woman invited me inside, saying she had something else she wanted to show me. My first impulse was to refuse the invitation, but her insistence and my curiosity got the better of me. I entered the house, and the darkness inside enveloped me almost immediately. The only light came from an oil lamp on a nearby table. As I walked behind the woman, I observed the old furniture and walls covered in paintings that seemed from another era. The house had a damp, abandoned smell that was disturbing. I wondered who else could live there, since there didn't seem to be anyone else around. The woman led me to a room at the end of a hallway. "This is where I keep something very special," she said as she opened a door. Inside, the room was filled with old objects and curiosities I couldn't identify, in the center of the room. "I wanted to show you this," she said, and before I could ask anything, she removed the cloth, revealing the mirror. The reflected image took my breath away. The image reflected in the mirror was blurry and distorted. I felt a chill run down my spine as the woman watched me intently. "This mirror has a story," she said without taking her eyes off me. "It is believed to reveal the past and future of those who gaze upon it." Her voice had a hypnotic tone that kept me immobile. I tried to look away, but something in the mirror drew me in. I could see shadows moving behind me, figures that shouldn't be there. "Do you see it?" the woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded slowly, feeling a mix of fear and fascination. "This is just the beginning," she continued. "There is more I want to show you." The woman invited me to follow her to another room. I hesitated, but my curiosity and the strange attraction that seemed to emanate from her pushed me to continue. As we walked through the dark hallway, I could feel the shadows getting closer. The house seemed to come alive around us, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. When we reached the next room, the woman stopped and indicated for me to look out the window. Through the dirty, aged glass, I could see the backyard dimly lit by the moon. At the garden's edge, I saw several motionless silhouettes watching us from a distance. Their shapes were indistinguishable, but I could feel their gazes fixed on us. "They are always here," the woman said in a melancholic tone. "Watching and waiting." I felt a wave of panic, but I tried to stay calm. "Who are they?" My voice trembled as I asked. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to me with a sad expression. "The mirror has trapped them," she finally said. Terror washed over me as I understood her words. The silhouettes in the garden were people trapped in an existence between the mirror and the real world. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked, trying not to let fear take over. The woman looked at me enigmatically. She said, "Because you have been chosen too." And at that moment, I knew I had to leave that house as soon as possible. Panic took hold of me as I heard the lady's words. Something in her gaze hypnotized me, despite the urgency I felt to leave that house. "You don't have to be afraid," the lady said in a calm voice, but her eyes said otherwise. The darkness around us seemed to intensify, making the shadows in the garden move more quickly. I tried to reason with her, asking for a clear explanation. "What does it mean that you've chosen me?" My voice trembled as I asked. The lady slowly approached, extending a hand toward me. "The mirror chooses those who can see beyond," she replied. "Now, you are part of this place." A chill ran through my body and I instinctively stepped back. I decided that I couldn't stay even a minute longer. Ignoring her words, I turned and ran toward the room's door. The lady shouted something behind me, but I didn't stop to listen. I ran down the dark hallway, feeling the shadows stretching out to catch me. Desperation and fear gave me the strength to keep running, not looking back. My heart was pounding as I rushed down the stairs. I could hear the hurried steps of the lady behind me, accompanied by the whispers of the shadows. I reached the front door and with trembling hands, struggled to open it. The door seemed to resist, as if an invisible force were trying to keep me inside. Finally, the door opened, and I ran out to my bike. The silhouettes in the garden were moving faster, as if trying to intercept me. I got on the bike and started it quickly, speeding down the dirt road. I felt a cold and oppressive presence behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I just wanted to escape from that cursed house. As I rode away, the lights of the house suddenly went out, plunging everything into darkness. The road back to the city was a blur of trees and shadows, and I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit, crowded area. I parked my bike and sat on the ground trying to catch my breath and process what I had just experienced. I knew I'd never forget that night or the penetrating gaze of the lady in the dark house. After fleeing the house, I headed to the nearest gas station, where I knew I would find someone to talk to. My mind was filled with questions and fears, and I needed answers. When I arrived, I saw a group of neighbors chatting near the entrance. I approached them cautiously, still nervous about what I had just experienced. One of the neighbors, an older man named Mr. Peterson, noticed my state and asked what had happened. I told him everything, from the delivery to the desperate escape. The neighbors listened in silence, exchanging worried looks. When I finished, Mr. Peterson sighed deeply and invited me to sit with them. "What you describe is not new to us," said Mr. Peterson in a grave voice. "That house has a dark history that many of us prefer to forget. The lady who lives there is known for practicing witchcraft. She has trapped several people in her cursed mirror, people who, like you, didn't know what they were getting into." Mr. Peterson's words made my skin crawl, and I knew I needed to learn more about what I had faced. Mr. Peterson continued his story, explaining that the lady of the dark house had arrived in the neighborhood decades ago. She reportedly inherited the mirror from her grandmother, a formidable witch. The mirror has the power to trap souls, and she uses it to maintain her youth and power. She will inevitably add those who gaze into the mirror to her collection. I interrupted Mr. Peterson, desperate to understand. "But why me? What did I do to deserve this?" Mr. Peterson looked at me with compassion. "It's not about what you've done, but who you are. The witch chooses those with strong spirits, people who can give her more power. You must have a special energy that she perceives." Over time, I understood the gravity of what Mr. Peterson had explained. The experience left me marked, and since then, I have never dared to go near the house again. Whenever I received an order to deliver there, I passed it on to one of my colleagues, avoiding any contact with that cursed place. Life went on, but I always had the shadow of that night in my mind. I learned to trust my instincts and be cautious, knowing that some houses hide dark secrets best left undiscovered. The story of the Lady of the Dark House became a warning for me and those who heard my tale. I really hope you liked this tale. I am thrilled to share these stories with you. Share this video with others so that we can keep growing and more stories can reach more people. Kindly provide your thoughts and experiences in the comments section. It will aid in my further development. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Many thanks, and I hope to see you again soon.